archetypes are important too. So with the archetypes, there are 7 archetypes, but there are really 6 archetypes, and the 7th is the scholar. And the scholar is mixed with the other archetypes. So someone could be a priest scholar. But let's look at them. Okay, so Celine Dion is a perfect example of the priest. She could have the priest collar, the white collar, or she could have a habit, like a nun or a Buddhist. She's got the face that when we look at someone that's a priest, they seem inspirational. They're naturally inclined to focus on things that are spiritually elevating in some way, even if it's just to promote kindness and goodwill for all. It's the way they'll do it. Whereas if you look at Oprah, and this isn't based on weight or lack of weight. Yes, we all look more skeletal if we're too thin, and we all look less defined if we are carrying extra weight. But this kind of top here magnifies the face to the top. So if I was doing that, it gives a different appearance. But in her case, she has a softness to her, and it was very hard for her to look tough. But as the social 2, with the server queen warrior, she looks formidable. But when you see her interviewing people, if she's unsure about something, she shows a shifting of her emotions. But when she's really confident is when she's giving things to others. She used to have giveaways like cars, all kinds of things. And then she had to pay tax on all the things that she was giving away, or the people had to pay the tax. So she stopped doing that and figured out other things she could do. But she's formidable in the way that the social 2 is, because they're the most ambitious combination of all. But she's got this be of service quality, and you can always see it in the eyes. Many, many type 2s are servers. The eyes are further apart. They look softer. They'll have a pleasant smile, but they'll also kind of shift their smile around. Now, if you look at Alan Rickman, he's an artisan, meaning there's movement all over his face, not straight angles like we see with Celine Dion. We see actually one shape to the forehead, the shape here. It's like if I were to put a tie on him, it would be a paisley, not a check tie, because there's nothing straight about him. He just looked crooked. People don't understand that. But if you have movement in your face, if you wear straight lines, then they compete. It's not complementary. On the other hand, if you combine the 2, it can be very interesting. So if you had like a window pane plaid with a paisley on it, the paisley would match the movement in the face. And then they kind of bring attention to each other. And that's what we find interesting. Like we expect plaids in a certain way, a plaid, a tie, or a plaid suit, plaid sweater, or plaid pants for that matter. But if the person doesn't have straight lines on their face, it doesn't look right. It looks good if people have a little squared jaw. It looks good if their features are like even. So don't be misled by that, but look to see what archetype they might be. And if someone's an artisan, they're going to have this creative look to them where they can do unusual things, and it'll be different for each artisan. But artisans have like a pretty quality that we really like to look at. And there'll be something with a wave or curve, and their face will have that kind of movement. They won't be straight. But if we look at Alan Rickman, what we're getting is kind of someone who seems intense and someone where we don't want to put a plaid on them. It would just be alien. I really loved teaching all this in person because then I could hold up, plaids and curves and show people how features become more dominant or more subtle, and that we are projecting onto people with their visual archetype what kind of person they are. And here's the thing, there's a lot of truth. If someone is a priest or priestess, king or queen, you ask them for directions or whatever you need to know. Like wherever I went in my life, from the time I was a young child, people thought I knew wherever I was. The store I was in, the grocery store, adults. So we project a certain quality. And there are other people, we project that they're bashful. And they are, because we unconsciously know the expressions. Now, Chris Rock is a double sage. So even with he's got the raised lip, corner of his mouth. And he's a 6. But notice how his features are, you see the humor more than anything. So sages are wise. They're usually quick-witted. They're usually very funny. And so think of the sage as someone that just looks like they're going to tell a good joke, or they're always telling jokes and they can do it really well. And you usually have a sage, but you could also have a contemplative that is very deep in thought, trying to understand the world, that could have a similar look, but they don't look as happy about it. They just have the wise part. And maybe they're funny privately, but we don't associate funny with them, but they could still be a sage. Now, the king and queen, Oprah's like a queen too. It's part of her top 3. And by the way, microexpressions, type, tritype, instincts, stackings, archetypes, all of them are stacked from what we use the most to the least. So it's a good exercise to do that with all things, types of empathy, types of our emotions, our tritypes. And from top to bottom, like all 27 subtypes, all 27 tritypes. Like knowing what you use the most and the least is very valuable at a more advanced level. But if we look at Queen Latifah and Phil McGraw, they just have an imposing quality. Now, they are 8s, but you can see a little contempt with Phil McGraw on the other side of his mouth from Chris Rock, right here. But sometimes, as I said, you can have nerves here. I know that when I had a crown done, like a year ago or 2 years ago, when I got the Novocaine, it was here. I didn't smile quite the same anymore. I didn't have an even smile. So by all means, find out what you can in a very diplomatic way if you're doing the deep inquiry process, which kind of gives you a way to calculate all this. But yeah, you think he's a little more surly than she is, but they both seem solid. And when you have a queen warrior or a king warrior, you have someone that has enough of a crown that they could have a crown on their head. So people with little tiny heads are not the king or queen in their visual archetype. They could be a scholar that just could have a crown. But again, I go into this more deeply in the class on it, and we see variables within type. But then here we have a great example of the warrior queen, where warrior comes first, then the queen. And there's a little more trepidation, not much. If you've seen Rosie O'Donnell, she's an 8, just like Queen Latifah and Phil McGraw. She's social. But just looking at her eyes, 8s always have an open mouth when they smile. And 9s often have a partially open mouth. It's like they're smiling. I can't quite do it because I go to contempt instead. They kind of go. And 2s can have a mouth that kind of looks like this because they are adjusting their expression to the person in front of them, but they're solid. Now, if you have really a person that's slight of build, that's really solid, then even if they're not even 100 pounds, their attitude and their internal confidence, they feel self-possessed. You have an 8, and it could be an 8 queen, or it could be an 8 warrior. A lot of times the athletes will be warriors, regardless of their Enneagram type. And then there are different types of warriors. Now, Daniel Radcliffe is a great example of a 5. He's got the bigger head and the narrower chin, so the teardrop, but it's got the square qualities to it. Here. So he's got the scholar that we would expect. And scholars a lot of times have their eyes really close together. And like their neck is smaller and their tie, because you need to choose your tie based on the spacing of your eyes and your jaw. A lot of people don't know that. They just go with the look that's in fashion. Okay, skinny tie, then you need skinny lapels and skinny collar points. They all need to go together. But here's the thing, they need to match you. So what can happen if someone's dressing in a way that's not complementary to their natural look? We kind of look again, it's not as harmonious to us. It's not as pleasing. But when it matches, even if someone has very jagged features, like one jaw is very different from the other, or one side of their face goes up, but they wear jagged clothing, it looks amazing because it's all congruent. And then we can notice subtleties, but that's the jagged line versus the artisan line, which is curves and weaving in and out. So he's kind of a cross. He's got the creative artisan look with those moving lines, but he definitely has the softness that we expect with a 5. But all 5s seem to have a substantial crown with a smaller lower face. And then warriors seem to have like a lot of square face, where this is shorter, everything's kind of short and compact. And then the shoulders and the neck, it's all more compact. So basically, there are these 7 archetypes. And this order is very important because the priest and server are 2 sides of the same spectrum. And if they work together on a project, the inspired qualities of the priest are kind of executed or supported by the server. Servers don't want to come up with ideas. They want to help them come into existence. So they often team up with a priest. And an artisan is to the sage. So the sage has the wisdom and the ideas and kind of the know-how. And then the artisan is the most creative combination. Double artisan's the most creative. But artisan priest or artisan server can actually make things happen because they have that creative piece, the moving lines and the curves. And then they have maybe the humor or the knowledge to have whatever they're working on manifest in a different way. And then king is to warrior. So the king, governs the army, so to speak. And the king can't function, king or queen, without their army. So that's why these pairs are so important. But when we look at famous people and we see what type they are visually, we then understand why we like them, or why those that are casting movies or a television show, they're working with archetypes. And the visual archetype is absolutely seen immediately. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to do anything. This is true in general with all my research, that we can identify things 80% of the time. And then there's always 20% that's atypical, wonderfully different, unique combinations. Now, here's an example. They're kind of typical and atypical. So if we look at Tom Cruise, he's a priest, see his angles. He's a priest artisan. He's got angles, but he has movement. But too much movement, like he played Lestat in Interview with a Vampire, and they gave him blonde hair that was kind of wavy. And he should have just had brown hair, but they were trying to make it match the book. And then Brad Pitt played the melancholy vampire, and they gave him, the dark hair. And in a way, too bad they had to follow the book. They could use those actors and just give them the opposite coloring. But needless to say, all that's happening. Sometimes you need to fill a character to look a certain way, because people who've read the book want the same person they've envisioned. But look at Russell Crowe. He's an 8, but notice the brows that go down. So he's a melancholy 8, and he's got the very defined, up here, he's got the very defined forehead, but he also has these sad eyes, and there's something reserved about him. And yet he can play a role like Gladiator and perfectly fit the long-suffering, gonna do what's right, no matter what it costs him. And it's not the one version of what should happen. It's just willing to self-sacrifice for what you believe in. But actually, if you watch him on Inside the Actor's Studio, which is like an interview where they're up there long enough to kind of assess them, he was interviewed, and he's very, very clearly the 8 with the 5 and the 4. And he won an Academy Award for Beautiful Mind, where he was playing a 5, 4, 8. So it was a good match, because I believe that if you have the same tritype as the person you're portraying, it's going to be natural. And otherwise, they kind of become a caricature. Yeah, now Kate Hudson, if you look at her eyes, she's got the sage, she looks funny, and she's got a little bit of the artisan. But what's more noteworthy is that she has these eyes that are the server. So she seems friendlier. And usually when we think of 7 as an archetype, it's sage or priest. So that's the other thing that happened, is as Naranjo was coming up with his archetypes of each Enneagram type, he based it on the subtype, and he kind of went with the most common example. Like, really, the priest was the 3, and the warrior was the 8, really the king warrior, and the server was the 2. And that's why when people say, oh, you don't look like this type or that, well, here's the thing. If you don't look like that type, and you don't have the microexpressions of the type, and you don't sound like the type, you're probably not the type. Because these are the things we can observe and we can listen to. The internal experience is wonderful and gives us a lot of very rich information. But there are atypical examples.